Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Delighted to see such a large crowd for this important discussion this morning. I'm Paul Grogan, the president of the Boston Foundation. I want to welcome you to the foundation. I see many familiar faces in the crowd, but also some newcomers. If this is your first visit to the Boston Foundation, a particularly warm welcome for you, and we hope that you have occasion to be back here at your community foundation many, many times. We are Greater Boston's Community Foundation, a more than 100-year-old charity that has provided over its life more than $2 billion in grants to Boston area nonprofit organizations working on a wide variety of issues in our city. There aren't too many issues that are more important than what we're calling the Transportation Dividend, transit investments, and the Massachusetts economy. After my very brief remarks, we have a wonderful opportunity to hear from Luis Ramirez, the general manager of the MBTA, who will address us. He apologizes that he does have to go after his remarks, but we're just delighted to have him here and very, very, very grateful. After his remarks, we will hear about the report itself and the principals who prepared it, Tony Horst, who's a PhD, national practice leader, transportation economics at AECOM, and Al Rain, PhD, also national practice leader, transit-oriented development. After the report is presented, Jim Canales, the head of the Bar Foundation, will moderate a panel to explore the implications of the report more deeply, and it's a terrific group. So we're very, very pleased to have them, and we will have everybody out of here by 10:30, as we always do. This forum this morning is part of a continuing series of forums that we host here at the Foundation under the banner of Understanding Boston. These forums are made possible by generous contributions to the Civic Leadership Fund at the Boston Foundation, which is our annual fund. I want to thank those of you who are contributors to that fund and urge those who have not yet to consider it this year. This report that we're going to hear about very shortly was a collaborative endeavor, and in addition to the authors and panelists you will hear from this morning, there are a number of organizations and individuals that really were indispensable to this effort. Rick Domino of A Better City, who we'll hear from later on. This wouldn't have happened without A Better City. Jim Canales and Mary Skelton Roberts of the Bar Foundation really co-funded the report with the Boston Foundation. Jim Aloisi for his invaluable editorial counsel, Mark Drayson of the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and we do have a number of elected officials here as well. Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu, Massachusetts Representative Brendan Crichton, and Massachusetts Representative Jonathan Hecht. And I also want to call out, I'm not sure where he is, but I know he's here, Steve Kadish, former Chief of Staff to Governor Baker, who has now been appointed the chair of the Transportation Commission for the state. So we've got some fabulous people here to explore this topic. Now, this is a topic about which people's feelings are usually well-formed from long experience, and we're sorry to say that mention of the T sometimes invokes a deep pessimism. Scarcely a day goes by without news stories on the MBTA's budget woes, and for anyone trying to get on the Orange Line at crush hour, well, good luck. And it's true our region's transportation problems are serious and public scrutiny is warranted, but that's not the whole story. Despite its well-documented flaws, our region's transit infrastructure represents a unique and highly valuable civic asset which accounts for a great deal of our region's economic success. We are in a very exclusive club. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C., and San Francisco are the only other major cities in the United States with what we call a legacy transit system, cities that developed public transit before the automobile became the dominant mode of transportation. And as this report will show, we benefit enormously from, we have benefited for over a century of investments in mass transit infrastructure. And these investments add up, as you will hear shortly from Tony Horst and Al Rain, who led the research. Even with its flaws, existing MBTA operations generate more than 5 times the value we spend to operate it in things like time saved in traffic and accidents avoided. In addition, the fact that we have a robust transit infrastructure has given us some protection from the sprawl that has ensnared so many other cities, and it has helped keep our downtown vibrant. And it's interesting to note that cities across the country are now trying to create transit systems appropriate for the vital and dynamic cities that we now have across the country, and they are spending tens of billions to do so. So we should count ourselves fortunate that with its well-known difficulties, the transit system remains a huge competitive advantage for Boston over most cities. Every weekday, people in Greater Boston take 1.3 million trips on the MBTA, and that puts us at the 4th highest ridership in the country. So despite its well-documented problems, what we have here is a remarkably important and valuable civic asset that has fueled our economic success and is essential to a prosperous future. It's a system that connects our businesses, universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions, linking and providing access to the assets that make Boston so special. Of course, even the most valuable assets can languish if they are neglected. But evidence abounds that the right public investments can have huge payoffs. For much of the 20th century, the Boston Harbor was the most polluted in the country. Today, it is one of the cleanest, and this now stunning natural resource has spurred an almost unbelievable wave of development and investment in our city, repaying many times over already. And this will go on, repaying many times over the public investment, the substantial public investment of about $5 billion that was made. So we have to remember that, though, improving our infrastructure has a cost, there's also a cost to not doing so, which can be tabulated. And I think this report does an excellent job on that. Thank you again for being here for this important conversation. Let me, without further ado, bring up the General Manager of the MBTA, Luis Ramirez.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for the warm introduction, and thanks, everybody, for having me here today. I especially wanted to thank Paul and his team at the Boston Foundation, Mary Skelton Roberts and the Barr Foundation, and the team from A Better City, especially Rick Domino, for collaborating on this report. This report keeps a focus on both what the T means to the region and also what the T needs to continue to do to maintain our support for economic growth, quality of life, and for the access the T provides to all of the opportunities the Boston region has to offer. This report documents in a great detail what I have learned in my short time here. You cannot separate Boston from the MBTA and the MBTA from Boston. I could also say that about the Red Sox, the Patriots, et cetera. The T is part of the region's cultural identity, but also it's an integral part of the region's economic momentum. In fact, as the report points out, the MBTA provides the region with an economic benefit of some $11.4 billion each year. While that is certainly a figure we can all brag about, the reality is we, at the T, need to do more. Let me give you a few other numbers for context. Over the past 6 years, the historic average in capital spending for the MBTA on state of good repair projects was $441 million. To be clear, that is not the entirety of our capital spending, but a good indicator of where and how we've been spending money and our money to keep the system up. Why do I bring this up? because we want to ensure that T remains the fundamental component of the region's economy, and that's not enough. It's not enough to maintain our system today and not enough to stave off the massive backlog of SGR investments we still need to make. Furthermore, it's not enough to keep pace with the increased housing construction or demographic and cultural changes that place higher value on living near transit. But consider this: the strength of the economy, judged only by the number of cranes and construction fencing, continues. The desire to rely more on transit and less on passenger vehicle increases. But all the while, we are combating Father Time as our equipment, vehicles, infrastructure continue to age, and we face issues of service reliability, crowding, and in some cases, declining ridership, who are opting for something else, in some cases, something better. And even more still, this is not to say, or this is to say nothing of what the future holds for our anchor industries and largest employers, our energetic and robust startup and entrepreneurial communities, and any other potential changes that may pose a danger to our resiliency when it comes to natural disasters, extreme weather, astronomical tides, and all of the above combined. But I'm not here to dwell on the negative. In fact, and the fact is, we've made some major program changes. We've implemented tighter controls. We've strengthened our internal capacity to execute on capital spending. What that means is that we closed the books in fiscal 17, having spent $709 million in total state of good repair spending, a mere $100 million away shy of doubling that 6-year average. We're also working on modernizing our core infrastructure and focusing on targeted expansion. For instance, extending the Green Line to Somerville and Medford, and outfitting our commuter rail network with positive train control equipment. We're also going to start a far-reaching conversation about our new system of fare collection, which we call AFC 2.0, which will completely alter the way our customers interact with the T. To be sure, these investments aren't just happening by accident. Many of you have heard of Focus 40, which is an exercise to develop a 25-year investment strategy. This complements our ongoing capital investment program, which is updated annually. But Focus 40, and with Focus 40, we can look at and look out further to the future and maintain a strategic focus that incorporates demographic changes, a changing climate, and evolving and emerging technologies that play a role in our future. Complementing that, we have a commuter rail vision study launching, which seeks to determine the thought process which will lay out a new procurement. Somewhat akin to Focus 40, this study will also contemplate a future commuter rail network with both optimization and optionality in mind. But as you know, right now, it gets people to work in the morning and home in the evening. But what else can it do? Are there opportunities to enhance services along corridors based on major employment centers that might be outside the immediate Boston core? Same with new clustered housing development. Are there ways we can enhance reverse commuting? Are there ways we can optimize regional rail travel from the farthest reaches of our commuter rail network in a way that can overlap and coexist with enhanced urban rapid rail transit-like services inside the core system? Our efforts to upgrade the entire fleet of red and orange line vehicles are underway, as most people are aware, but it's more than just vehicles. Yesterday, in fact, we had a contractor forum to entice interest on a component project to upgrade and modernize the yard infrastructure and maintenance facilities at Wellington and Cabot. Last and certainly not least, for those of you who took the bus here today, there is a 33% chance you rode in on one of the 375 new buses that were delivered this past year. Recent trends show that bus ridership has experienced the largest decline, and this is one of my biggest priorities, to earn back those customers that we've lost. We aren't just going to do this through new buses. We are also targeting the rollout of technology that prioritizes buses through congested signalized intersections. And I'll say this to this group, we're putting out the call for help and getting additional space on surface streets for more dedicated bus lanes. A few other things this report points out. As this is a reminder to me and to my workforce of how important our work is to the success of this region. Every bus driver, mechanic, track walker, inspector can take pride in their job every day knowing we make Boston run. The region depends on us. And the region's success is based on the 1.3 million trips taken each day on our system. And not just the trips, but 1.3 million stories of our customers. One of these 1.3 million stories is a medical professional on that bus headed to one of our world-class hospitals. Another one is a first-generation college student on the Green Line going from class to their job. Another is a parent of the commuter rail, on the commuter rail rushing home to make it to their child's performance. Another is an employer who's looking to expand and relocates near transit to become part of this system. And there are so many more. We know the T is critical to the economy of Boston, but it's the stories of our customers that motivates us all to work and keep doing what we're doing to improve the system. As we strive to do our part to make strategic investments and open a window to the future, I look forward to working with you and continuing this conversation about the ways in which we can continue to yield dividends through our work together. Thank you.
Luis, thank you so much for being with us this morning, and we do understand that you have to go, but appreciate very much your making the time to be with us, and there are formidable allies for you throughout this room. So let's hear about what's in the report. Tony Horst, AECOM, has had more than 20 years of experience supporting project development and implementation and was the lead author of our 2013 report, The Cost of Doing Nothing. Al Rain has 40 years of senior level experience in transportation and urban development projects. Your willingness to disclose that is admirable, Al. Including Assembly Square and the iconic Denver Union Station. Al is a local and served in a variety of very important public policy posts, mostly in the Dukakis administration, and he was the executive director of Massport in the 90s. Tony and Al, thank you.
Thank you. We can't hide our age. I'm just going to speak for a moment and introduce Tony. And General Manager Ramirez, thank you so much for being here. We're very lucky to have that guy. So metropolitan Boston consists of 164 cities and towns. That's how our friends at MAPC define it. That's how we defined it in this report. And the importance of those 164 towns, the region, to the economy of the Commonwealth is obvious and speaks for itself. 69% of all the people of the Commonwealth live in the metro region, 74% of the jobs, 84% of the annual gross domestic product of Massachusetts is not surprisingly in metropolitan Boston. And everybody has spoken about the 1.3 million daily trips on the T. What we've been asked to look at is what's the relationship between those two sets of facts? What makes the transit economy relationship tick? We began our look at that at the regional level, and my colleague Tony Horst is going to take us through that.
So thank you, Al. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to talk to all of you and share some of the findings that we've gotten about the connection between transit and the performance of the economy. Al's shared with you thank you. Al shared with you a few facts and gave you a good snapshot of the Boston economy. To that, I'd like to add one more. And that's that Boston's economy is the second most expensive place to do business in the US across metropolitan economies. This is a cost of doing business index. When you look at it, the metropolitan average cost is cued in at 100. If the line is above 100, a place is more expensive. If it's below 100, it's less expensive. So when you look at Boston's value at 120, the interpretation is that it's 20% more expensive to do business in Boston than the average metropolitan area in the US. There's a number of metropolitan areas there. If you go from Boston to Washington, D.C., you've basically traveled the NEC corridor and have the costs there. The red bars are technological hubs, innovation hubs, other competitors. Why does that matter? Well, costs are a weight on the economy's performance. Over the past 15 years, a 10-point increase in that index has correlated with a 15 basis point reduction in average annual growth. So why would any business locate in Boston? Well, on the flip side, it's a highly productive economy. The GDP per square mile is 6 times the US metropolitan average. That's huge, and that's a function of both the concentration of commercial activity in the economy, but also the mix of industries. It favors high density, high value added businesses that are transactional focused, that benefit from the exchange of ideas and the density and option of commercial activity here in the economy. 37% of the metro area's jobs are located within a half mile of the transit stops, and that's about 5% of the region's land. So not only is there this huge concentration within Boston, but across the metropolitan area, you see a concentration of activity around the transit stops, seeking the access and the connections to the rest of the metropolitan network. So urban areas overall are always in this balance between adding economic opportunity, adding growth, and managing the costs of that growth. And when you think about density, you're really talking about congestion. And so we wanted to understand that linkage and what transit generates and how transit supports that balancing act that cities have. So we did an experiment and we modeled what would happen to the performance of Boston's economy if all the transit riders had to take another mode of travel. And what we found is that first and foremost, there would be a large loss in travel time costs, or that people would incur travel time costs. And so roughly what people save by using the T is about $7.1 billion annually in avoided travel time costs. Similarly, there's travel cost savings in terms of fuel and maintenance of autos and parking and all those associated costs. And that's real savings that go into consumers' wallets. That's money that can be used to pay off student loans, buy houses, go out to dinner a couple more times a year. Similarly, there's avoided costs in injuries and fatalities. The crash rate on transit is typically less than in autos. And then finally, on net, there's avoided pollution costs. So if you add all of those things up, you get $11.4 billion given the current size of the economy. But what I think is most striking is what's not there. We looked at what would have to be built to maintain that same level of mobility if transit wasn't there. And our estimate came out at about 2,300 lane miles of highways, 3,000 acres of parking spaces, and billions in land cost. But the most striking thing is the loss of the highest and best use. If all that land is devoted to highways and parking, it can't be used for other things. It can't accommodate that commercial activity that makes the metropolitan area so productive. And I think the picture here is much better than the numbers. The picture you see at the top is a planned highway project that didn't happen in Boston. And the picture down below is exactly the same place as it stands today. So what could have happened and what did happen and what was accommodated because of the much more efficient footprint of the T and the transit system and what was accommodated there. So just to put those numbers in context, the one-time cost of building those highways and roads is about $15 billion. That excludes the purchase of right-of-way. We didn't try and estimate that. We know it would be large, but we didn't think we could get a good number there. So we just went with the $15 billion to build the stuff. There's the estimate, the annual recurring estimate of benefits at 11.4. And then compared to that is the estimated cost of backlog to bring the system into a state of good repair and the annual operating benefit for transit. But finally, before I turn this back to Al, I'd like to just make one other point, and this picks up at some of the early comments that were made. The current system is really the legacy of past generations' investment decisions. If we didn't have that system today, Boston simply couldn't fit as much commercial activity into the same footprint. We couldn't handle as many people, we couldn't have as many employees and businesses, and the place just wouldn't be as productive as it is. It could not compete as it does now. Between 1980 and 2015, Boston's inner core grew by 13% at a time when the inner core of most other places was declining. You know, that underscores that competitiveness that's provided by the core. So with that overview of the economic linkages between transit and the economy, I'd like to hand it to Al, who's going to talk about current and future opportunities.
Thank you. And for those of you who've been around long enough, you will recognize that the 20 community inner core subregion, which MAPC defines and we borrowed, not only includes almost the entire rapid transit system, everything except Braintree Station, but the original 14, the MTA, which the predecessor of the MBTA, was 14 communities that are part of those 20. And that legacy just runs very deep in the ground. And that's what I want to talk about. The regional economic benefits that Tony just described, they are regional. And you measure them at the level of the regional economy, but they're operationalized and they're seen and felt on the ground, where people make decisions every day about where to live, whether to buy a car, whether to lease office space, which development projects to permit, whether to open a store. And we wanted to take a granular look at the nexus among transit, economic development, and everyday economic activity, especially in the inner core, the 20 communities inside 128, where most of the T is located. And in order to do that, we defined a sample of 24 districts that we call transit growth clusters. And each of those, as you might imagine, is served by transit, in some cases multiple modes of transit. They're all either established or anticipated development hotspots, some of them we read about every day. They're characterized by the kind of walkable, bikeable urbanism that we associate with transit-oriented development, and in which metropolitan Boston is really a national paradigm leader. And when you put those 24 districts on the map, and I'll show you in a second, you immediately understand that they're not individual outposts of development or aspirational development. They really form themselves, and you see it right away, into a series of strategic corridors. And specifically, we describe them as a hub and 5 regional corridors that are strategic, radial corridors rather, that are strategic at a radial level. So here's the hub, consisting of 6 transit growth clusters, all of which you'll recognize. You can see this. You can see the red line tying 4 of them together. You can see the extent to which the Longwood Medical Area and Back Bay depend on the green and orange lines to be tied to downtown. And as an example of one of the radial strategic corridors, here's the Near North Shore, which consists of 4 of our transit growth clusters, from the East Boston waterfront through Chelsea at the interface of the new Silver Line Gateway and the commuter rail rail, the tremendous transformative opportunity of Suffolk Downs and Wonderland, and another tremendous transformative opportunity on the Lynn waterfront. And what jumps off the map is how the Silver Line Gateway, which the T is going to open shortly, the Blue Line, the commuter rail, and beleaguered, over-congested Route 1A tie those together and really turn them into something we can think of as a strategic corridor. Now, we analyzed these growth clusters across two key economic dimensions, the first of which is development capacity. And it's not just anecdotal or topical that the market is attracted to these places. When you look at development that's recently built, under construction now, or in the active pipeline, you find about 49,000 units of housing. And when you look at land areas within the growth clusters that are not yet in the specific planning stage, we estimated the capacity of about 49,000. The 249s are a coincidence, about 49,000 more. On the job side, when you look at recent, current, and pipeline commercial and industrial development, you find enough room for about 146,000 jobs. And again, when you look out to land areas that are right near stations and growth clusters but don't yet have specific plans, we saw the potential for about 116,000 more, give or take. Obviously, these are high-level estimates, and the numbers will change as events unfold. But the order of magnitude, as well as the fact that these 24 clusters are a subset, they're not all the places like that in the inner core, tell you that these growth clusters, this concept of these transit-rich hotspots, have the capacity to absorb virtually all the growth that's projected for the inner core, and to replace a lot of the existing stock as it wears out and turns over in a more transit, pedestrian, bicycle-friendly kind of way. The other key economic dimension that we looked at was labor market connectivity. It's not enough to build a lot of houses, build a lot of jobs, very important, but not enough. You have to connect them in a way that's both efficient and equitable. And if you look at the transit job and labor sheds, to what degree can workers find jobs, and to what degree can businesses recruit workers within a 30-minute transit trip and a quarter-of-a-mile walk? You find that the region as a whole, which is one of the most transit-oriented regions in the country, pales in comparison to the performance of the growth clusters. They just have a real ability, they're hubs of labor market connectivity. And there's an affordability and equity dimension here that's very important. The growth clusters very, very much outperform the region as a whole in terms of much lower rates of automobile ownership, much lower rates of automobile usage, and whether that's by choice or by economic necessity, it means that you have affordable levels of commuting throughout the inner core, and this is something that corporate decision makers get. With the recent announcement that Philips is putting their headquarters at Cambridge Crossing, that's 7 corporate headquarter locations right next to stations in transit growth clusters in the last 3 or 4 years, as well as the decisions to redevelop the Flower Exchange and the Globe site and several other locations as employment campuses right on the T. People understand this connectivity aspect. So what does this mean for the transit system? It means a lot of what General Manager Ramirez outlined earlier. When you look at the strategic corridors and growth clusters, what comes up over and over again are the needs to invest in the reliability, capacity, and connectivity of the system. If you talk to anybody making investment or residential decisions, you're going to hear 1 or 2 or all 3 of those words. Reliability, people typically are talking about state of good repair, about the reliability of the system, and the commitment that the general manager mentioned to attack and eliminate with a consistent program of investment, that $7.3 billion state of good repair backlog, the over $700 million that they're getting out the door in fiscal 17 got out the door, is really critical. Capacity, it means a lot of things, but particularly when you look at the growth clusters, it's the core capacity of the rapid transit system. Every single one of these growth clusters, and all the other ones we might have looked at instead, depend either directly or one connection away on the capacity of the rail rapid transit system and the Silver Line. And the tremendous program that the T's undertaking now on the fleet replacement of the red and orange lines and the ancillary investments that the general manager mentioned is critical to how all of this works. And it's fair to say that the green and silver lines are kneeling in a very large on-deck circle. And that brings us to connectivity. we see in the growth clusters and strategic corridors the opportunity for growth-driven service enhancements that reimagine how the T's existing footprint is used. And we saw 4 categories that kind of fill that bill. One is this idea, which is really becoming a proven business model, of creating infill stations in partnership with developers, institutions, municipalities, big employers. People don't come to the T and say, I'll pay to help build a station, unless that's a real development opportunity. And we've got success stories at Assembly Square in Boston Landing, the relocation of Leechmere Station at the head of the Green Line extension are great examples of that. And you look throughout the system in the inner core and outside the inner core. These are inner core opportunities. And you see other opportunities, mostly on the commuter rail, but the T and MassDOT have talked about River's Edge on the Orange Line as opportunities for infill stations in partnership with people who want to invest and develop in those locations. The second is to make bus transit more rapid. And that can mean bus rapid transit where that's physically feasible, full-fledged bus rapid transit. The Silver Line Gateway, which the T's going to open shortly, you can go see the test runs now on that right-of-way, is a great transformative connectivity project for $85 million. I mean, it's a tremendous project that proves we can do that. But even where full-fledged bus rapid transit isn't feasible in a particular corridor, as the general manager mentioned, dedicated bus lanes, signal priority, you can do a lot of things, as they're doing in Everett and on Washington Street and Rosendale and a lot of other places, to make bus transit work more rapidly and feel more like rapid transit. And all of this builds on, as Luis mentioned, AFC 2.0, the new fare collection system that'll make everything work better. And what's valuable about these opportunities is they can not only connect growth clusters within strategic corridors, but a lot of these opportunities would connect growth clusters across strategic corridors, and that's very important because those connections often don't exist in an efficient, high-capacity way now. The reimagination of the commuter rail system is a very exciting possibility, and it really means 2 things. Within the inner core, there's this idea of urban rail, more transit-like service with shorter trains, multiple units, greater frequency, and 3 corridors that that struck us as candidates over time is the Fairmount branch, which everyone talks about, the idea of a near North Shore line from North Station to Lynn, and a Charles River line from Riverside in through West Station, Back Bay, and South Station, and there are perhaps others as well, but these are directly tied to transit growth clusters and the opportunity to put a more transit-like service into those places. And what that helps you do, among other things, is to create a more robust two-way regional service to the cities and towns on the commuter rail system outside the inner core, particularly regional urban centers and gateway cities whose historic cores where the stations are have this transit pipeline to the core of jobs in downtown Boston. There's a very important and very well done Mass Inc. post yesterday on this very topic that I would all urge you to look at. And finally, there's a lot of attention and excitement about using the harbor, not for the occasional ferry, but to create a more system-level ferry system that's seamlessly integrated with the landside MBTA, and probably half the people in this room are working with Boston Harbor Now, MassDOT, A Better City, the Convention Center Authority, and others to try and make that happen. So 3 takeaways that we hope you'll take away. The first is, the Metro Boston economy, which is absolutely the engine of Massachusetts, is powered by transit in ways that we all understand anecdotally, but which Tony's data tells you in a very dramatic kind of way. And it is that transit power that enables the density and productivity that overcomes the high cost of doing business, the otherwise high cost of this region, and that headline that every year the MBTA generates quantifiable benefits that are worth more than 5 times what we as a Commonwealth spend to run it. Secondly, these regional benefits are experienced on the ground, where transit-rich locations have the capacity to support an enormous amount of housing and job growth and to connect them in ways that are efficient, affordable, and productive. And the payoff, to fully realize that opportunity and to sustain the investments that are already being made on the assumption of this kind of transit, we need to invest strategically in the reliability, capacity, and connectivity of a 21st century transit system. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I see Al looking at his watch saying, I was on time, 9:15, and here we are. That was perfect. I want to thank Tony and Al for the fantastic work that they did on this report and for the conversation that it's now about to engender. I'm Jim Canellis. I'm the president of the Barr Foundation, and we are proud to be one of the sponsors of this important work. And I'm joined by a terrific group of leaders up here, and I'll introduce them very briefly in a moment. But let me just set the stage in terms of what we're hoping to do this morning. So the quote from the report that jumped out at me that I think frames our conversation is the following. Households are choosing places to live, businesses are recruiting workers, and developers are increasingly building projects on the assumption that transit service will be adequate and reliable. The report clearly quantifies the inextricable connection between transit and our economy, noting that it has a positive return, and you heard a moment ago the $11.4 billion in benefits that it provides each year. But what's another important point in looking at all of this is that it's often easy in these conversations about public transportation to focus solely on the users of public transportation and to forget that those who do not use public transportation benefit significantly from investments in our public transit system. And that's part of what we're going to talk about today. So this morning we want to explore some of the subjects that the report has teed up. The authors also write, Boston finds itself at a mobility crossroads. So this morning we want to talk about how we manage this crossroads and the various paths we take to a productive future. I'm delighted to be joined by an outstanding group of leaders who are going to help us make sense of all of this. Our panel represents academia, the private sector, the public sector, and the nonprofit sector. So we'll definitely have all the perspectives represented today. You have the bios for our panelists on your chair, but let me just do quick introductions. Starting at the far end, Chris Dempsey is the director of T for Mass, which is a statewide coalition that advocates for safe, convenient, and affordable transportation for everyone. He has served as an assistant secretary of transportation for the Commonwealth, worked as a consultant at Bain & Company, and has been at a transportation technology startup and on a number of local and statewide political campaigns. He's also very proud to say he's a daily transit rider and who has never owned a car. Next to him is Councilor Michelle Wu, who was first elected to the Boston City Council in November 2013 and was the first Asian American woman to serve on the council. In January of 2016, as you know, she was elected by her peers to serve as council president. She is currently the chair of the Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation, as well as the chair on the Committee on Census and Redistricting. For any of you who follow Councilor Wu on Twitter, and if you don't, I would recommend that you do, you'll know that she and her family are frequent users of our public transportation system. Welcome, Councilor Wu. Jared Johnson is a real estate project manager at Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation and a leader in equitable transit-oriented development, as well as a major supporter of the Fairmont Indigo Line, which you heard Paul speak about earlier. He's also a board member with Transit Matters, and I know many of his colleagues are in the room today. He's a former AmeriCorps alum, working with Cities of Service and the City of Boston to establish the Love Your Block Neighborhood Revitalization Grant Program. Welcome to Jared. Rick Dimino has served as president and CEO of A Better City since 1995, and as you know, was the lead sponsor of the report we are talking about today. Prior to his role at ABC, he served as vice president and deputy manager of Stone & Webster Engineering Corporation's transportation business sector. He has served as Boston's Commissioner of Transportation, chairman of Boston's Central Artery Tunnel Project Interagency Committee, and has been a member of the executive committee of the MBTA Advisory Board. In addition to his long career in service in transportation and urban planning, we are told that he plays a mean jazz guitar. Welcome to Rick. Bass guitar. And last but certainly not least, Rosabeth Moss-Cantor holds the Ernest L. Arbuckle Professorship at Harvard Business School. And her latest book, Move, Putting America's Infrastructure Back into Lead, is a sweeping look across industries and technologies shaping the future of mobility and the leadership required for that transformation. She's an expert on strategy, innovation, and leadership for change, and explores these topics in her many award-winning and best-selling books. Welcome to you, Professor Cantor.
Thank you.
So let me start with you, Professor Cantor, because I think we have an opportunity. We've been focused this morning on talking about Boston and the Commonwealth. This is also an opportunity to talk about what are some of the national trends? What have we seen in other places that can provide inspiration for us? So you write in your book, or you've written, maybe not in this book, but in something I read, quote, change requires political will, public support, and private sector savvy. So what have you seen in your travels that gives you hope and that might serve as an inspiration for us here?
Well, first of all, for no matter how much we think our system has deteriorated, many other cities in the country look to Boston as a model. So we have a way to go. If I can make a few comments based on national data. First of all, I think the report was terrific. Congratulations to Tony and Alden, and to you, Rick. I think it sets forth much data that I have looked at, but there are just a few others to keep in mind. One is, Chris has an example of the millennials who don't have cars. I mean, the alternative, the competition, the hidden competition is cars and ride-hailing services. And cities all over the country are coping with how they coexist with the great need for public transit because of the problems with cars. And there are two groups that don't own cars. One is millennials, many of whom don't even have driver's licenses, particularly if they grew up in cities. Are we reaching them? I mean, are they here? Is the tech community here? Who's here? Many existing civic advocates, and all around the country, they don't know how to bring tech and young people to the table. The other group is the poor, and the poor also don't have cars because they can't afford them. And so there's a fairness and equity argument about public transit, and many cities are dealing with that. But it turns out that if you put together several data sets, for example, of the 20 cities considered best for public transportation, 10 of them are also the cities with the highest rates of upward economic mobility from the bottom fifth to the top fifth between the ages of 16 and 30. That is, public transportation is a ticket out of poverty, as well as a preference for another set of people. Secondly, the pollution effects were mentioned, but there are two we should keep in mind. One is the public health costs. Harvard School of Public Health has estimated that we cost nationally at least $15 billion a year in public health costs from traffic congestion alone, which is often people driving around looking for parking, but it's not healthy. And so everyone suffers because of that, including the people who are not using cars. Then there are the environmental effects. Of the carbon emissions in the United States, which is the largest carbon emitter in the world still, about a third of that comes from transportation alone, and of that, 2/3 of that amount comes from cars. So cars, we have to think about cars and how cars coexist or not with public transit, which does take cars off the road. But how do we get the, and then the fairness and equity arguments I already mentioned, but how do we get it to happen? I've been in cities around the country, all of which have this on the agenda now, and it is a matter of leadership and public will. First of all, there needs to be a sense of shared fate, that we're all in this together, and the people have to be willing to pay for it, and the public sector has to have the courage to ask for it. So there's a huge disaster waiting to happen. Probably everybody saw the articles about it in the New York Times under the Hudson River, because the tunnels are crumbling, and yet the financing had all been lined up several years ago, and the governor of New Jersey said, no, I can't ask the taxpayers to pay for it. In fact, people will vote to pay for it if they see not only the benefits for them and their own commute, And not simply the benefits for developers, because that's controversial around the country too. Do we really want cities to get larger? So growth is not considered an unmitigated good. But people will pay for it if they see the benefits not just to themselves, but to quality of life. And so I was very happy that this report also mentions walkability, biking, complete streets, and how we ever convince the car to make way for all the other forms of transportation. So that's one part of political will. The other part is leaders who advocate and stick with it. One of the best projects in America, which got all kinds of awards, I think it's one of the best, we can have our ideas about best, is a tunnel under the Port of Miami, which has taken 80,000 trucks off the downtown area, reduced pollution, got them right to the interstate where they can load the goods on trains. That took about 30 years worth of advocacy. 30 years of somebody who first worked in the local DOT, then later became the state DOT head, that worked with politicians, that was considered a civic leader on this. One has to have patience, because to get the public will means sticking with it and advocating it. And then finally, technology. What are we doing about technology? It's great to know that the T is adding technology for fare collection. It's going to have positive train control. We have to not just repair, we have to innovate. And maintenance is not a vision. You don't rally people behind just bringing up to the way it should be, which means it's already 10 years behind. You get excitement, public support, and political will because we're creating some things that are new. And who better than Boston to create that? Why are we not bringing the tech community to the table to not just think about, ride-hailing may in fact make cities greener. It is competing with people taking public transportation. We don't know what automated vehicles will bring, but we do know there are many systems waiting to be invented. Some of them may be a little weird, like cable cars above the streets, or Hyperloop tunnels somewhere.
Or gondolas?
Gondolas? Yeah, well,
I'm gonna move us on.
same idea as the cable cars. But why aren't we inventing it? Why aren't we imagining it? Why aren't we getting school children thinking about it? And as we want to invest in the best public transit system in the world, we don't want to be looking at bus rapid transit in Brazil and saying, or in Chicago, which is starting to do that, and say, how can we get up to that standard? We want to invent a new standard. We don't want to say, how do we have acceptable buses? What about bus shelters? What about amenities on buses? It pains me greatly that Bridge went out of business. I know a lot about Bridge, the pop-up van bus service. It was doing very well. I know I taught a case on it. I know why it went out of business, but we need that kind of innovation where we have things that have amenities, Wi-Fi.
Can I move us on?
Yeah, we're going to move on. My last comment is that in some cities, they don't refer to homework for school kids. They call it train work. So public transit is a place also where people have to be able not just to get to work, but to do work.
Thank you, Professor Cantor, and as expected, you've brilliantly laid out most of the issues that we plan to talk about today. So let us now dive into a few of them. I'm going to work down to this end of the panel because I think the political will issue is one that merits some further discussion. And we have somebody who's on one side of the political will, getting a lot of sort of temperature directed at government around these issues, and then others who are directing some of that at government. So would love to hear your perspective. How do we, from the government side, how do we get the kind of political will and courage that we need from our public sector to do some of the things we've been talking about today?
Yeah,
Well, first, thank you so much for having us. I'm very excited to be here representing the council, but also I'll try to make sure to give as much credit as possible to the great work that the administration has been doing under the mayor. We have some reps in the House, too, from our transportation department and others. So part of it is establishing that vision that Professor Cantor's talking about. And one of the first things that the mayor did in office was embark on several large planning processes, one focused on transportation. And if you take the time, the Go Boston 2030 report is worth every minute that you spend reading, because it lays out all of the big picture ideas that residents across the city really contributed. So it's everything from some water transportation, urban rail, to dedicated bus lanes, et cetera. On the council, we're also trying to really make sure that we're having a comprehensive conversation. This is the first time that the Planning and Development Committee has explicitly included transportation as part of its purview, trying to recognize that we cannot have these decisions in isolation, and every action we take to increase housing, to add more commercial buildings, we have to think about the transportation impacts and how connected all of that is. And in fact, it actually affects every other issue that we think about as a challenge for the city. So housing and where we're able to increase affordable housing is exactly linked to the likelihood that someone will be able to then move from their house and find their way to the job through the transportation network. Education and the school budget being so dependent on how we're transporting our kids and where families are choosing schools. Public safety and the opportunities are connected to different neighborhoods. For me, it all comes back down to this idea of inequality. And we heard about the economic inequality and the impact of transportation, but Boston is also a city that is having a serious conversation now about race. We've been having it for many, many, many years, but thanks to the Globe Spotlight series and other more recent developments, I think everybody is really talking about and opening their eyes to the fact that when you grow up in one zip code of Boston, your life outcomes and your likelihood of moving up are very different from elsewhere. And you see that reflected across our transportation system. When I get from Rosendale to downtown by commuter rail, not a very diverse train car. Sometimes I'm the only person of color. When I take the bus, it's the exact opposite, reflective of Boston and my neighborhood's diversity, but it's also sometimes 45 minutes or an hour longer of a trip, less predictable, and the cost differential is what drives that segregation. So the good news is that we at the city level are trying to prove that it's not just a state issue, it's not just something that we can sort of shake our fist at, but we can actually collaborate and make a difference. I know the Transportation Department has been working very closely with the MBTA to think about bus service. We've piloted now, very successfully, I think, right, Vinny, the dedicated bus lane on Washington, with a fuller pilot to come in the spring, and making some signal priority innovations and tests across the city. There's a lot more that we could be doing, thinking about transit, the MBTA as one piece of everyone's commute. In order to empower people and enable people to take advantage of cycling and walking, often cheaper and more accessible forms of transit, we have to have this link of the MBTA, whether it's subway, urban rail, water transportation, as that affordable, reliable connection too.
Great. Chris, thank you. I know folks will not feel offended if you don't applaud after each of them, and we can applaud at the end. So Chris, sorry to steal your applause in a moment, but speak about this political will issue, because you're obviously running a large advocacy coalition right now focused on these issues. How do we get this to move forward?
Jim, I was noting in the introductory remarks today about how our transit system really is a legacy of the past. And there have been so many moments in the past where we've been willing to make really important investments that make today's economy and the strength of our community possible. Two that I think of, one is at the turn of the last century when the legislature commissioned the Longfellow Bridge, then known as the West Boston Bridge. And they actually wrote into the legislation that created that bridge that they wanted to make it wider than it needed to be because they suspected that there might be a new technology that would someday go over the middle of that bridge. And that, of course, became the Red Line, which is now a very old technology. But imagine what Kendall Square might look like, or Central Square or Davis Square or Alewife would look like if we didn't have that red line connection, if the red line terminated at Charles MGH. Our regional economy would look very different. And that is the definition of an investment, right? Is you're willing to forego something today for the benefit of the future. So we've done that. And then last night, I was riding on the Orange Line on the Southwest Corridor, and that's an example where we took a moment in time to say, as was pointed out, let's not build a large expressway here. Let's instead use that space and use it for a much more efficient form of transportation, like the Orange Line and the Northeast Corridor. So we really are the beneficiaries. Now, I should say, we also clearly have issues today of underinvestment. And the Orange Line car that I rode in last night is older than I am. And I'm 35 years old, and this is a car that was built in the 70s, right? And that is too common today. Now, we're lucky that we have new orange and red line cars being built, and I think it's important not only that they're being built, but that they're being built in Western Massachusetts and assembled in Springfield to try to tie us together as a state and to remind folks that a thriving economy in Greater Boston can also help Western Massachusetts and vice versa. But it's very clear that we are not doing enough at a regional level to make investments. We were out in Seattle in September as part of a study tour, and we saw the growth of the economy there. It's a city that had more cranes in the sky than any other city in the United States for a period of time over the last few years. They are making a $56 billion investment in their light rail system. They're doing that through a regional ballot initiative, a regional ballot process that raises that money regionally and allows those dollars to be spent regionally. We don't have that framework here in Massachusetts. We either fund things hyper-locally or we fund them at the statewide level. And I think that is not necessarily the way that we want all of our investment to be made. So giving cities and towns and regions here in Massachusetts the tools to raise more of that money regionally to make investments, I think would be a beneficial thing. But I'll go back just finally to the legacy of the past and our need to look to that and take that responsibility. Seattle is making that $56 billion investment in light rail in the hopes of creating the highest ridership light rail system in the entire country. We already have the highest ridership light rail system in the entire country. That gives you a sense of the value of that investment. If you don't already get it from the report that came out today and the great work that Al and Rick and others have done, $56 billion they're spending to try to get something that maybe will eventually look like the Green Line. So we have, I think, a generational responsibility to future generations of Bostonians and Massachusetts residents to make some of those same investments, get our system working well, so that those future generations can benefit in the same way that we're benefiting today.
I want to go to Jared and pick up on your point about thinking regionally, because I know that that's a topic that Jared's interested in talking about. And coming back to Tony and Al's report, they talk about this hub at the center, but then also these regional connections and some of the opportunities there. So Jared, I know you wanted to reflect on some of that based on the work you've done, and maybe help us sort of draw that connection to the regional context.
Yeah, absolutely. The report really picks out urban rail and regional rail as a strategic investment that really needs to be made to tie some of these areas in. And I think I don't think this will be too controversial of a statement, but the innovation district has more kind of more lean toward larger tech companies now. And so I think with things like regional rail, we have the opportunity to make some of our gateway cities, make some of those our next innovation districts. And I think there's so much potential out there to really tie the region together by looking at what are those investments in bus rapid transit corridors or in like I said, in that regional rail to really look at how we tie those communities together. And I think I just think that that's such a really important point.
And Rick, the business community, we heard a lot about the need to think about public-private partnerships in this work. Help us understand how the business community is thinking about this. Are you seeing the same kind of hopeful signs that Tony and Al are?
Oh, the signs are really clear and have been clear. But as Al mentioned earlier, I represent an organization that has the strongest economic drivers sitting on my board. And they're constantly referring to the notion of our relationship to transportation and our future economic growth and the ability to sustain the economy that we have today. And anecdotally, as Al mentioned, I've been around town since I was the commissioner and a planner and the head of this business organization, saying the T is the backbone of Boston, the region, and the state's economy. This report proves that fact hands down. And I think we need to really start thinking more clearly about the relationship between the notion of a $2 billion investment and $11 billion return, and what that means to both what we refer to regularly as making sure that we're keeping up with the state of good repair. But I want to reinforce what Professor Cantor said. Maintenance is not a vision. Just keeping our system reliable and keeping our system operating, making sure that our systems can confront severe storms and winters is, at our base, a core responsibility of all of us. But we need to do something strategic now to keep up with the relationship to the job clusters and the labor clusters that are referenced in this report. The business community is really concerned about the relationship to continuing to invest in this region, in this city, with the notion that we won't be able to get people to jobs and jobs to people. And this report clearly spells out that in the Unicor and the metropolitan region, people want to locate there and jobs want to be there. We're talking about over 100,000 in each category. And there's, I'm so pleased there may be representatives of the Globe in the audience, that the Globe moved downtown. Because now the same reporters are waiting and seeing trains go by and buses go by that they can't get on because the capacity of the system can't accommodate people that want to be on it. And clearly this report indicates that there's growing demand relative to the relationship to rapid transit and commuter rail and buses. Now, I don't want to really get involved with the debate that the market share of the total relative to the transit. I mean, people want to get on the T. Let's be honest, okay? They want to get on the T. They want to be able to get there. We need to do a better job of connecting people that need affordable access to the T and making sure they're getting better transit. The labor force, the people that represent the desire to have people get to these jobs, want people from these places to be able to work for them. So we have this real serious challenge of making sure that we're connecting and advancing a set of strategies that go beyond maintenance. And to be honest with you, the financial paradigm that even relates to maintenance today of the transit system is seriously under threat. The good news is that we invested in the Green Line. The challenging news that in a few years from now, that's going to undermine the possibility for us to continue to sustain our ability to keep the system reliable. What a strange point that I just made relative to what this report says. That's unacceptable. So the business community is looking forward to working with the larger community and with our elected officials to drive that change and put it in place right away. In the meantime, as we've discussed, we have serious challenges of connecting people of color to our jobs. We have the serious challenge of actually transportation exceeding buildings relative to their contribution to greenhouse gases, and we're not doing anything about it. So I'm hopeful. This report was prepared with the business community's hope, with the good work of our consultants, Al and Tony, and also I want to thank you, Jim and Paul and the Boston Foundation of our foundation, to really make sure that we're catalyzing an important discussion to make the investments and be ready for the change that we need to put in place, not in the future, but now.
Go ahead, Jared.
And I just wanted to pick up on that point, and I definitely agree with Professor Cantor on, I think that, the crossroads that's mentioned in this report, I think it's a chance to really reimagine how the MBTA, delivers service. Again, things like, making bus service not just adequate, but desirable, making it so that people want to, locate businesses and live near our key bus routes. Looking at, how do we make our ferry system, how do we make that part of our TOD strategy? So I really think, that's the thing that people can rally behind is taking this opportunity to just reimagine what the MBTA looks like and think about what are the ways we get the tech community involved. Exactly.
Professor Cantor, I love how you said, maintenance is not a vision, and the way the room just resonated to that comment. what it speaks to is that the way that we sometimes frame and communicate about these issues can be very, very powerful. And it's interesting that when we think about the T and we think about the issues that we confront, and even the way Paul introduced the session today, that we all immediately get into the zone of negativity or pessimism or a sense of, oh, this thing is so beleaguered, it's so broken, we're never going to repair it. So I'm wondering, picking up on something you also wrote, is you said we need to frame a new narrative about the role of transportation. And one of your quotes is, mobility is essential to opportunity. That this is a way for us to talk about the role of transportation in our lives in a different way. And so I'm wondering, not just you, Professor Cantor, but let's have everyone weigh in on this. How does narrative and framing and communications play a role to build the kind of public will that we need to address the challenges we're talking about? And anybody can weigh in.
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in because it's been something that I've been thinking about this morning and reading the report. What we're discussing in terms of a region anchored by certain hubs and corridors is extremely important, and we need to understand the quantified benefits of our transportation system. But what makes Boston special is its neighborhoods, the character of the city. People move to cities not just because there's a job and there's a way to get to work, but because there's something special about the culture, the other things they can do that really grasp at us as human beings and not just worker bees and this and that and family members. So I think from the city level, what we want to see is a transportation system that does not just empowers people to get from where they live to a downtown job, but really makes every community, every neighborhood a destination. It's those small businesses that are owned by the local resident with that unique niche menu or local flair, or the people who really understand the dynamics of that particular neighborhood that make Boston special and that make any city special. And to empower that to happen, we have to have that connectivity. So it's really not just about creating this hub and spoke where people live, they wake up, they hop on the T and they get downtown, but what do people do for fun? How do we encourage the culture and diversity of each one of our communities? That means that people who live in the Seaport need to be able to get to Roxbury to enjoy the jazz clubs and to partake in the restaurants there. West Roxbury has to be more than just a corridor of banks, but it has to be small businesses and nonprofits and arts centers. That's only possible if we invest in this very, very fundamental underlying first condition of transit, which then enables economic mobility, enables racial equity, enables climate justice, all the things that we're looking to long term.
That's a really fabulous thought about how one uses transit beyond commutes. So public transportation has to be flexible. It's why I love the bridge. It wasn't exactly pop-up, but it was smaller units instead of big buses on fixed routes. It was flexible routes depending on time of day. Think about television, broadcast television for a moment. It used to be there's a fixed schedule. You have to watch that program when it's on, or you miss it and that's it. Then you could get to it later. Now, schedules mean nothing. Everything is on demand. So if we're thinking about the potential, we should use our infrastructure, and of course you do need some fixed routes because it's a basic, but how do we add flexibility? How do we have it mean something different on weekends and be used to get to different neighborhoods? We have to promote that. That has to be part of the vision. That doesn't just come from the transportation system itself. And I love it because you're right about the gloom and negativity, because I've also said my favorite stop on my book tour was Jon Stewart, one of his last episodes of The Daily Show. You can't scare people into change. There are accidents, there are disasters, and nothing, we know this about guns. Gun violence, we know it about transportation accidents. It happens and everybody decries it and there is no change. Change comes because somebody gets excited about how I could use this differently. And if we add that and then do all the things, we could get those economic benefits, but we could get them in a slightly different way, different depending on day of the week, time of day, who the users are, what they get because of it. That's exactly the kind of imagination that I think we need.
Yeah, so this notion of innovation and creativity the cultural richness of our neighborhoods. Connectivity is really at the core of this discussion in so many ways. On the other side of this discussion is this notion that, as the report highlights, we're talking about huge volumes of people. So ride sharing and AV technology is not going to be able to accommodate the movement of large volumes of people in and out of economic centers, okay? Let's accept that fact, because I obviously am a big fan and I see great opportunity there, and we need to really embrace these types of opportunities. But there's a substantive, really underlying challenge of the notion of really the growth of our region and its relationship to the rest of the state. A quick set of examples. One of my favorite, there's another, believe it or not, in the Longwood Medical area is one of those existing development areas that Al highlighted. Another 8 million square feet of growth wants to take place there. And it's happening as we speak. It's happening as we speak. Now, the Longwood Medical area recently did an analysis of the zip codes of the people that work in the Longwood Medical area. So think about the huge Massachusetts map for a second. Every single senatorial district of Massachusetts had people that were working, putting food on their table and shelter over their families, which I'm trying to, a job is really important. Doing that and commuting every day to the Longwood Medical area relative to those jobs. During the peak of that growth of the Longwood Medical area, they were looking to hire 1,000 people a month relative to the relationship to what was occurring there. Now, obviously, the economy's back on steroids. The job market and the growth of that area is now hot again. But the relationship to that area is incredibly constrained. So let's take another example, and I'll just mention the South Boston waterfront. We talked about it earlier. 17 million square feet of growth wants to continue to occur there. The analysis that we recently concluded said that 63% more trips, 67% of those trips want to be on transit, and the Silver Line in the morning is at 123% capacity. The job shed for the South Boston waterfront, the seaport, extends everywhere through the metropolitan region. We have people coming from New Hampshire and Rhode Island to those jobs. Jobs and connectivity regarding large volumes of people need substantive transit solutions. It's unacceptable that we have an unreliable commuter rail system. We say that 70% of the Massachusetts population have access to transit. That's because of our commuter rail system. We obviously have substantial growth in the inner core and lots of people in the region, but the rest of that relationship relates to commuter rail. I heard that Steve Kadish might be here. Thanks, Steve Kadish, because he's the person that tried to move the needle to make that system better. But even with that great effort, it's still unacceptable today. The reason why we've seen a reduction in commuter rail, my belief, is because it's an unreliable service. So we need to do something to make it better. The notion that the governor wants to connect to the South Coast, great idea. The opportunity to connect gateway cities, affordable housing to the core, we need money to do that. Currently, zero funding for that project. So my point is that while I want to embrace technology and I want to absolutely support these intimate relationships to where we want to live, I also want to make sure that we're really driving substantive transit solutions to address our economic needs.
Chris.
Yeah, so Jim, your question was around how do we get the public to sort of embrace some of these ideas. And I think it's important to note that transportation is a very personal experience for people. People think about it based on their own experience. And I think that can be an enormous advantage because people, and the polling shows this, people that are not MBTA users still understand that their life can be better off or is better off because of the existence of the MBTA. So one of the emotions that I want to evoke in regular voters when I'm talking about MBTA investment is them sitting in traffic. We have the 6th worst traffic in the entire country in Greater Boston, and those drivers are fed up with it. It's soul-crushing traffic. They're missing time with their family, they're missing doctor's appointments, or they're late for work, and they understand that investments in the MBTA should help that. And they may have no interest themselves in ever becoming an MBTA commuter, But if it can take a few cars off the road that are around them and they get a faster trip, then they understand that they'll be better off. So it's about communicating not just to business leaders and not just talking about the economic development of this, but the very personal experience that people have using the transportation system. It gets me to one of my favorite topics, which is the allocation of road space. And we've talked a lot about buses today and improving our bus system, including giving buses dedicated lanes, which is absolutely something we should be exploring. But we should also be talking about how inefficiently we use our road space and how other regions around the world and around the country are better allocating that limited resource through much smarter tolling policies than the ones that we have today. We toll in a smart way in the sense that we have all electronic tolling. We had 80 years of physical toll booths in Massachusetts from 1934 when we built the Sumner Tunnel until the spring of 2017. So we toll in a smart way because it's electronic, but it's a really dumb way in terms of our pricing system. We charge the same price no matter what time of day you want to use that road. If it's 2 in the morning when it's in low demand, or if it's at 7:30 in the morning when it's incredibly high demand. But even more importantly, from a political perspective, is we don't really do a very good job of showing people what they're getting for those dollars. It used to be true that when you drove on the Mass Turnpike and you paid your $1.50 at the toll booth, you actually felt like you were getting a better trip because the road was smoother and was more frequently paved than some of the other highways in our system. That's no longer true. You're now on the Mass Turnpike, you have the same poor road conditions and you have just as much congestion as anywhere else. Yet you're paying and the folks that are driving on 93 or other roads are not. So if we told in a smarter way that showed people that it could actually be used to reduce congestion and improve their quality of life, there would be much more goodwill for using that as a policy, not as a way to raise revenue, but just to manage that limited resource in a much smarter way.
So tolling in a smarter way is really congestion pricing.
Yeah, putting together two of words that most people don't like to hear together.
As I said earlier, I'm not framing the issue particularly well, but I wanted to be direct.
But I want
Jim, I call it smarter
Yeah.
tolling.
Smarter
that's
tolling,
at least
thank you.
Much
one word that people like and one word people hate.
And by the way, why shouldn't it be used to make money? I mean, why shouldn't it? Besides the symbolism, but that's all part of this being flexible. A road is not the same road at different times of day. It's understanding use a lot better. And by the way, Seattle, which is making that huge investment, is probably the most congested city with the most lost productivity, so they sort of got it. And I don't think they care that much about losing the other Amazon headquarters because too many people anyway. But in terms of selling to the public, I want to come back to a different kind of technology and a different generation just for a moment. Because in Miami, which is floating and is going to be floating before the voters, paying for a 6-corridor plan, and the first of its kind in that region, which is not very transit-oriented, there was a millennial activist who managed to gather an enormous coalition of people bigger and more important than her, of all the civic organizations to create something called Transit Day, promoted on social media. Transit Day. And they got elected officials to ride. They got a big fuss. They had a large number of postings afterwards. They got international attention. And it made it kind of fun and cool to be promoting this. So that's all part of the vision too, and how one sells it. Not reports are great and yours is wonderful, but how are we taking advantage of the people who are going to be the future users, future voters, and are going to bring solutions?
Well, go ahead, Jared.
Yeah, and I think also the equity component is a huge important part of how we sell this, and I think Professor Cantor, talked about this in terms of, there are so many studies that show that the connectivity is more important than education, more important than almost any other factor in determining someone's how much they're going to earn and their ticket out of poverty. And I think, Michelle also brought up the conversation now that we're having about race. And I think I was looking at a study the other day that was looking at commute times across, and this was just the city of Boston, but Mattapan had one of the highest percentages of folks who take transit every day, but also it had the highest number of people who have commute times of an hour or longer. And so I think, that's just something that we, as a Commonwealth, as a community, we have to say is just unacceptable. not that it's a scientific, study, but I, on the way over here, just looked up on Google Maps how long it took to get from Mattapan to Longwood, where there's millions of square feet being added. And it's about 55 minutes, multiple buses. And in a car, it's maybe 20 minutes. I mean, that differential is huge. From Revere to Kendall, it takes 3 modes of transportation and about an hour. So when we think about, how are we, how are we becoming, not just an economy that's continuing to grow, but how are we becoming an economy that's growing evenly and that's spreading that wealth across the whole region and across, low-income communities and communities of color? I think we need to think about what investments are we making, and are we making them fairly, so that everybody is sharing in that growth that's happening here across the region.
And that's precisely why my colleague, under the leadership of my colleague Mary Skelton Roberts, who's here in the audience, that we initiated over the last number of years a real exploration of the role of bus rapid transit. And it's not just because, we want to be cool like Brazil and Mexico and other cities that have done it so well. It's for this very issue, that it's a mechanism that we can use to move people effectively, to move them efficiently, and that doesn't require major, major investments in order to make it done right. So the kind of analysis that Jared just described is also one that Boston BRT did. You can find it on the Boston BRT website, that shows the exact corridors and opportunities in this region to be able to improve that kind of connectivity. Yeah, please, Rick.
It's a perfectly wonderful point. Getting to visit Mexico City, for an example, they carry the same number of trips every day, over 1.3 million trips, just on their BRT system. Imagine that. Right. One line. So, again, I want to make sure that we understand that, right? So, working together with the city, this Washington Street route, that route, by the way, is kind of like a mega route for buses. The idea of opening it up and creating, and it's one of the wonderful, it's an equity route. It's just why, we worked on figuring it out. There's these types of corridors that exist throughout the region. And through a reasonably low-cost capital investment, we've seen incredible opportunities for this connectivity and actually helping to address not only important access and mobility issues, but significant equity issues. So we need to step up. I talked to the city the other day. We have maintenance facilities for buses that can't accommodate the volume of buses that we're growing to have. We need to be on that. We need to know whether there's a capital plan that's going to be able to do that, because we want to grow bus rapid transit. And you have to have both the ability to invest in those vehicles and the ability to maintain those vehicles if we actually want to move the needle to get there.
I love the idea of stepping up, because bus rapid transit, say in Chicago, it manages to shave maybe 10, 20, 30 seconds, minutes off the entire route. Not very fast. So, maybe it doesn't have to be very fast to make a big difference when you do that in the aggregate. There's a lot of talk about whether we should have high-speed rail. We have high-speed rail. It's called the Acela. Ha ha ha.
Except in Connecticut.
Except in Connecticut, where it can't go. The point is, what we call, in various parts of the country, they're working on high-speed rail systems that are going 70 miles an hour. Are you kidding? In Japan, 150 to 200 miles an hour and never late. So we have to also think about our standards as we do that. And if we want to raise our standards, even if it seems like it's a little bit of a stretch from where we are now, but where's our Elon Musk? A few moonshots, he actually is getting that rocket up there, amazing. So where are our people who say, let's invent the way and test it here? We're here, let's test it, it's us.
Well said. We're going to go to questions, but before we do that, let me ask one other one. And Chris, I thought you were going to go somewhere different when you were talking about the way we use roads. I thought you were going to migrate to talk a little bit about biking infrastructure, other forms of mobility that we should be thinking about in addition to transit. So just to give any of you on the panel who I know have passion about these issues an opportunity to address that piece of it, and then we'll go to questions.
Jim, I would say we talk a lot about technology and technology saving us, and I'm glad that there is some skepticism about that, because I agree with that. But a lot of the technologies that we want people to use are actually 19th century technologies or earlier, right? We want people to be taking transit, heavy rail transit. We want people to be cycling. And cycling hit its peak, I think, in the United States around 1900 or 1905. And we want people to walk, which is the oldest form of transportation of all. We absolutely need to be encouraging those modes because those are the modes that support the most density, which, as we pointed out, is what gets us the most economic productivity. I mean, that statistic from this report that on a per square mile basis, Greater Boston is 6 times more productive than other regions around the country, is because of that density and that urban fabric. We are so fortunate to have built out a lot of our region before the invention of the automobile, when we were much more reliant on those older technologies that support that density and support that livability and that growth, and we should be doubling down on that.
Michelle, I want to give you a chance. I know this has been an issue.
I think this is an issue of shifting from a mindset of scarcity and it can't be done to what the opportunity is. Had the privilege of going to see some cities with a few folks up here in Northern Europe who have similar size, similar density, similarly narrow roads, and accommodate hundreds, thousands of cyclists every morning. And you think about just picture in your mind someone who commutes to work in Boston. You're probably thinking someone who, wearing Lycra, helmet strapped on, aggressive cyclist. And it's because our infrastructure is not designed to make cycling safe for everyone. When you go to cities that do it well, when there's protected lanes that do not make it possible, that prevent crashes because the cars are physically unable to wander over the lane or make the turn into the cyclist, when you make it truly safe for everyone, you see moms cycling to work with babies strapped to them. You see women with their heels and their full professional dress, families cycling to school together. It opens up a mode of transit that is not just more equitable because it's affordable and you don't have to pay for gas and it's cheaper to maintain a bike, but that is healthy too for everyone. And some of these cities have quantified exactly how much they're actually saving in societal costs from someone biking a mile versus driving a mile. So that's wear and tear on our roads that's not happening because the bikes are much lighter. That's physical public health impacts of people not breathing in exhaust and getting little exercise. And that's also people opening up the opportunities for people from all backgrounds to be able to get to work more efficiently on our roads.
Great, let's open it up to questions, and in the interest of trying to get as many in as we can, let's just try to be brief and make it a question rather than a statement. Let's go right over here if we could, please. Thank you, Namrita.
Thank you. Namrita Kapoor, Environmental Defense Fund, and I really appreciate this sort of systems level conversation. And there might be an elephant in the room that we're not addressing in the system that reared its trunk very clearly early in January with the bomb cyclone storm. Talk to me about how are we thinking about climate resilience in our transportation system?
Excellent question. We have recently hosted a number of panels and conversations and working with the mayor on what's called Climate Ready Boston. And infrastructure organizations have been part of that conversation. I guess the best thing I can tell you is that the good news is that all of the infrastructure agencies, including our utilities, have done and continue to do excellent work in terms of doing a vulnerability assessment of their assets in relationship to climate impact. We now have some very good, well-articulated details of what it means for our transit system, our highways, our airport, our port, our water and sewer system, et cetera, the MWRA. Each one of them are really being very, very focused on that. And each one of them are taking incremental actions to address those things. Some are at greater levels, and some, frankly, are just still at the beginning stages of that. The larger question associated with this is the relationship to actually identifying and targeting those interventions that are going to be necessary to protect these assets. And then, even bigger question is how do we finance it? And as I mentioned earlier, we're struggling to keep pace with the state of good repair of our transit system. We're getting back to, where's the person that wants to go to the moon? The, kind of national imperative that should be on the table relative to this issue is just not being discussed at all, and in fact still being impugned, strangely. The governor recently just put forward the notion of us working together on a climate adaptation program as an executive order. I thought that was a very good and important step. But eventually, we need to kind of build off of these vulnerability assessments, target the right interventions, and then finance them and get them done. And that's essential. And that can't be rhetoric, and it can't be hiding behind the, we don't know how to pay for this, because we really have to do it. Great question.
Bob, over here. Make sure you get a microphone before you say anything.
Hi, thank you. Is this on? Yes. Bob Kuttner, editor of the American Prospect, former Globe columnist. We're doing a series on mobility in both senses of the word, thanks to the Barr Foundation. And the other elephant in the room, in both senses of the word, is who's going to pay for this. The last time the feds were really serious about this was the Great Society. We're still living off of some of that legacy. And we have a Republican governor who's about as good as it gets under Republican governors, who's a fiscal conservative. We have business leaders in this coalition who don't like to see their taxes raised. And we have limited fiscal and bonding capacity at both the city and state level. This is an enormous amount of outlay to do this properly. Where do we think the money might come from?
Well, first, as a representative of the business community, we've actually clearly articulated, and actually did a few years ago with the support of the Barr Foundation and the good research and support of Northeastern University, a very detailed description of where the money can come from. We targeted those things, some of them related to where the business community needs to step up, some of them related to what Chris was talking about earlier, which is this huge bucket of transportation user dollars that we're just not thinking about and using. The strategic relationship to a price of using the roadway relative to the economic return per family in the metropolitan region, which was, what, over close to $6,000. Thanks. So think about that. So, and we're maybe charging $2 every once in every once in a while for people who use the road. I mean, so your question is right on the money, no pun intended. The business community has been, for example, you might remember this, the business community pulled together a coalition, raised $3 million to make sure that we can, and we got a vote on indexing the gas tax. The business community led that initiative. That was going to generate $1 billion over 10 years. Some political leaders decided that that wasn't a good idea. They worked with the community, got that on the ballot. Even though we raised $3 million, in this case, the Republican Governors Association put in $12 million, peeled off $7 million, and attacked that very basic question. We lost by 4%. So we need to have both political will, elected officials that are willing to move away a little bit from fiscal conservative rhetoric, be willing to work with us on thinking about what do we do about those revenue streams, be having an honest conversation, and then put them together and get the job done. If we approach it intellectually in an honest way, using data, and talk to the stakeholders about how do we pay for this, I bet you we'll come up with a solution. But we need to be able to do that.
So just one elephant in the room that we haven't talked about, apropos of that, is the federal government. And it wasn't just the Great Society. There was, in fact, investment after that, and it was our former Congressman Tip O'Neill, as Speaker of the House, who advocated for a very long time to get mass transportation, public transit funds added to the highway tax, the gas tax. Now red states are raising gas taxes actually ahead of blue states. And where's the federal government? And, you know, well, that's the elephant. We won't talk about that elephant.
Jared and then Michelle quickly, and then we'll go back.
Yeah, and very quickly, I think there have been two bills that have just languished at the State House. One around allowing for those regional ballot initiatives to allow groups of municipalities to come together and tax themselves, and another one on value capture. And so I think, you know, it's also incumbent on us to talk to our representatives and our senators and say, you know, where's the movement on that? You know, we need you to show we need to show some political courage, and we need to get these bills, you know, I mean, just get them passed. I mean, it's, you know, well, then we can worry about, the campaign that will have to happen to pass that ballot initiative, or worry about, the campaign that will have to happen to designate the value capture. But, we at least need to have the opportunity to do that, because right now, municipalities and communities don't have those tools.
Well put, Michelle.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize that there are things that we can do now. So there's certainly these big picture, federal, regional pushes that we need to think about politically. How do we get that done legislatively? But even starting at the other end of the spectrum, every single development that happens in Boston, even if it's a two-family or three-unit building being built, transportation needs to be part of that conversation. How do we talk about development in a way that values the impact and brings mitigation together with transportation? We're seeing cranes all over Boston, so every single development needs to have this as part of that conversation. How does the funding in the immediate area help benefit the access to transportation? And then there's sort of systems at the city level. We're having a difficult conversation about resident parking right now, and whether this resource of on-street parking that's being given away for free, no limit on the number of permits, no charge whatsoever, should some of that value be captured to demonstrate again to the local areas that when you contribute, you can see better sidewalk or faster sidewalk repair. You can see cycling infrastructure installed, all the way up to those statewide ballot questions, and kind of taking it to the people outside of your direct legislative representatives, asking for support for the Fair Share Amendment, asking for support for other larger, more ambitious projects.
30 seconds for Chris, and then Rick, and then we'll go back.
I just echo Michelle's comments, and I'm unfortunately pessimistic that I think we're going to see new revenue out of the federal government. So I don't think we should, while I'd like to look to them for revenue, I don't think it's happening. And we hear a lot of talk about encouraging the states and local governments to generate more of their own revenue. And we often hear from local electeds that, well, there's no revenue to be had, and so we need it to be coming from the feds. But as Michelle has pointed out, there are absolutely opportunities for revenue at the local level. Local level. Boston is really the only major city in the US that doesn't charge for residential parking permits. So there is a source of revenue that could be had. But more importantly, this is about the system level thinking, as was brought up in that question, about transportation funding. And these systems will work better when they are funded by the users. It will create more efficient systems. It will show people the true costs of their behavior in the system and give them the right incentives to take actions that make all of us better off. And so that's an important principle for us to be thinking about when we fund transportation.
Rick, quickly, and then we'll go back.
Sure. A couple of quick things. One is the revenue streams that relate to transit are currently under assault. What do I mean by that? There's likely going to be a ballot question this November on the sales tax and it going down. So we're talking about innovative ways to push back on revenue opportunities that relate to local strategies like resident parking, to congestion pricing. In the meantime, 1 cent of the sales tax goes into our transit system every year. And there's a possibility that we're going to see that reduce, the total revenues from the sales tax reduced by $1 billion. The possibility then, puts the legislators in a space where they need to push back on that commitment to transit because they can't pay the bills of the Commonwealth. So I just want to make sure you understand that. And I testified, I represent the business community against that sales tax being reduced. So more of us need to, push back against those efforts to take those resources away, and then at the same time, I said, have these honest discussions, both at a local level, regional level, and a state level, to see if we can come up with a strategy that makes sense to develop a comprehensive transportation finance plan.
Great, thanks. Mark?
Good morning. My name is Mark Ibunya. I'm the co-founder of Transit Matters. I think the room is very, very full of elephants, and I think one of the biggest one is voter confidence in the agency. Voter confidence in the agency is also driven by the volatility of the program and political leadership. In the 8 years that I've lived in the Boston region, there have been, I think, 5 general managers, all under 2 different governors. And so Rick mentioned, called out South Coast Rail and the fact that it doesn't have financing, but it's been a project that's been on the books for years. We have a number of capital programs that are underfunded, that are not funded actually. And we have a long wish list, and we're all in agreement in this room that we need to invest in transit. So how do we deal with voter confidence in the agency itself? Everybody wants transit, but nobody wants to fund the MBTA. So how do we deal with that discrepancy there?
I would just, as with many projects that sometimes require a little bit of a leap of faith, and also this sense that you're doing something that you might have to give up a little for the greater good, it's often most beneficial to start with small examples of success, pilot it somewhere, show that it works, get buy-in in that area, and then expand. So that's why I'm so excited how we're working on the dedicated bus lane pilot. We're taking a corridor where we know that so many people are already on transit, the delays are already greater on average than anywhere else in the system. This is somewhere where it will make a huge difference. Testing it, once, twice, and now moving to a full week in the spring to ensure that oh, okay, is it more of a need? Correct me. 4 weeks, great. So doing a 4 full week pilot in the spring to show that this makes a difference. And then other corridors in Boston, I think, will be more likely to have that conversation about giving up parking in order for this to happen.
Great. Quickly, Jared, and then I want to come, if we can bring a microphone over here.
And just very quickly, I think we also have to be we have to be as strong in praising when the T gets something right as we are when our commutes go terribly. And I think an example of that, when we talked about earlier, is the Silver Lake Gateway, which is coming in, I think, on budget or reasonably within budget, an $86 million project that's going to really transform the region. And the great job that the T did value engineering the Green Line extension, and then having a bid come in that's actually going to put back a lot of the things that were cut. And so I think, making sure that they keep a close eye on that and making sure that that project management goes well, and I hope it does. And when it does happen, making sure that we're giving the T praise we're deserved. And I think that will help to restore some of that voter confidence.
Well put. Let's go right here in front.
Good morning. My name is Mela Miles. I'm the chair of the Fairmont Indigo Transit Coalition. And there's a lot of elephants in the room, I would agree. One of the things that I wanted to refer to is the House Bill 2723 that was proposed by Evandro Carvalho to run a 2-year pilot of the Indigo Line vision along the Fairmont corridor, where we would have more frequent service, and also more frequent service. A fare collection would be addressed by allowing people to use their Charlie cards on the line, and syncing buses to the trains, and so on and so forth. But what I would like to see is, where is the support for that, to get that up and running? And I also noticed in the report that was put out that the urban rail vision was there with multiple units and more frequent service. And so tying those two things together, what does the panel have to say about that?
Does anybody want to comment on that? Rick?
Sure. The Fairmont line has always been, will always be, the place where we should get urban, real, rapid transit-like service in place as soon as possible. One of the things that the Patrick administration did at the tail end of his administration was get ready to do a procurement around diesel motorized units, and they were going to put them on the Fairmont line. That procurement was put in on a grinding halt. The good news is that the notion of urban rail is getting a new focus, and the Mass DOT has put out another opportunity to examine that very question. But again, this is not something that needs a lot of nuclear science and kind of real careful research. We should be testing that type of rapid transit service on the Fairmont line like next year. And I'm only saying next year because that's maybe the quickest we could potentially do that using the existing rail stock that we have now, which is not great, but we should definitely be moving forward to understanding that, because as the report highlights, that the commuter rail system and the potential for an urban rail system is right in front of us, meaning the existing asset and right-of-ways are there. We just need to move forward to maximize those assets and develop a new technology regarding vehicles to be able to drive transit opportunities using the exact system that's placed, and the Fairmont is one of the places where she could start.
Jared?
Yeah, like I said, I agree completely. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to talk about that and make sure that Fairmont line is top of line, because I know Transit Matters is releasing a report soon. There's a Commuter Rail Council. Livable Streets is doing a lot of work on this ahead of the T's Commuter Rail Visioning Study. So I think just making sure that we're always talking about making Fairmont line the priority to get a pilot done. And I think we've identified the Fairmont line and the Providence line as the two just easiest ones to do. And I think even on a line as short as the Fairmont line, we saw what, Mark, like a 7 to 10 minute 7 to 10 minute time savings that could be had if we look at those diesel multiple units or electrical multiple units to pilot on that line. So I think that's an easy low hanging fruit.
Al, were you going to add to that?
Yeah,
It's on.
is it on?
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Fairmount, count me, and the Fairmount has to be number one. It couldn't be otherwise.
She's got one for you.
Just going to speak up, Al.
Now is it on?
Yes.
There we are. Yeah. Fairmount needs to be number one. There's not only a long-standing commitment, I think a political and moral commitment to do that, but you've had all of the improvements in the stations, including the construction of Blue Hill Avenue Station at long last underway. And the difference, one of our transit growth clusters of the 24 is Lower Blue Hill Avenue, where you have this convergence of the bus, the key bus route, the 28 on Blue Hill Avenue itself, the Fairmount line, and the Mattapan trolley to the Red Line, and there's a lot of transit there, but it's less than the sum of the parts. And the opportunity for Mattapan Square, Lower Blue Hill Avenue to be a place really driven by extraordinary transit is there. And there are complicated decisions to be made about the Mattapan Ashmont line to make sure that's a dedicated right-of-way, high-capacity, high-speed transit service forever. Certainly one of the BRT corridors that we envision, which everybody else envisions, is on Blue Hill Avenue. Not hard to imagine a BRT system that begins at Mattapan and one branch goes all the way to Dudley and one branch hangs a left on Seaver Street and goes to the Longwood Medical Area. But the thing that's there now, not carrying many people, is the Fairmount line. And it would be a tremendous thing to have urban rail on that line.
Thank you, Al. I'm going to wrap us up, and I'm going to do just a speed round and literally work our way down. We'll start with Chris. We'll end with Professor Cantor. We've talked about a lot today, anchored in investing in transit and improving this system. What's the highest leverage opportunity that you see in this calendar year for us to make progress on these issues? One sentence.
Smarter management of our road space to get buses moving faster.
Thank you. Michelle.
Building safe cycling infrastructure, because when cycling is safe, almost every other mode of transit is safe too.
Thank you, Michelle. Jared.
Use the Commuter Rail Visioning Study to promote regional and racial equity.
Thank you, Jared. Rick.
Strengthening the public's understanding of the incredible work that's being done to actually use a tax dollar and a transit dollar to make our transit system better today, because I got to give the Baker administration a lot of credit for doing that. And then building on that confidence so that next year we can have an honest conversation about a transportation finance solution for this state.
As a former English teacher, I can't resist but note that was a run-on sentence. Professor Cantor.
I was hoping Jim was going to catch me.
I just want to say amen, semicolon. Having the conversation, thinking systemically, public mobilization, and putting the entire picture in front of the public, not piecemeal, but systemically.
Thank you. As As Paul mentioned a few weeks ago, the governor announced the creation of a commission on the future of transportation that's going to be chaired by Steve Kadish, whom I see here in the room. And I think that that is going to be a tremendous opportunity for us to be engaged in a dialogue across the Commonwealth on these issues and many of the other related issues, including all of the elephants that have been referred to that are in the room. We clearly have tremendous strengths and resources in this region, but we also have a tremendous opportunity to build a transportation system that's worthy of a world-class region. And I think that's the challenge before us. And with this pun fully intended, I think for us to make that happen, it's our move, because we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and dig in and lean in and work hard and push for that vision that we seek. So with that, I want you to join me in thanking this fantastic panel for the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you. You did a great job.
Thanks.